Hello everyone, and welcome back to Zozo Anime, the place where we dive into the hottest spoilers, detailed breakdowns, and the craziest mysteries in the world of One Piece. And today, what we are talking about is not just a simple flashback chapter, nor is it just another spoiler to read for fun and move on. Because the closer we look at the current storyline, the more it feels like Oda is setting up a massive twist. On the surface, it may seem like the story is slowing down to explore Brook's past. The kingdom of Asperia, Princess Shuri, Queen Candle, King Reuven, and all the old tragedies buried for decades. But in reality, the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that this flashback is not here to cool things down. On the contrary, it is quietly pouring more oil onto an even larger fire. A battle involving identity, memory, soul, and possession. To put it simply, if we gather everything that has been revealed in the recent chapters, the story is no longer just about Luffy fighting Emu, Loki clashing with Emu, or the Straw Hats trying to handle the battlefield in Elbaf. No. It is beginning to turn into something much darker, deeper, and more painful. Brook, Shuri, Gunko, Emu, Asperia, Film Red, Tot Musica, demonic contracts. Abyss marks, and one extremely uncomfortable question: is this still just a war for power? Or is it actually a war to reclaim the human soul? First, let us return to Brook's flashback, because this is the foundation for everything. We are taken back to the time when Asperia was still shining brightly. This was when Brook had not yet become the walking skeleton we know today, the old man who cracks jokes and asks about panties. Back then, he was a stylish swordsman and musician. Glowing with charm, the kind of guy who could make ladies fall with one note of his violin, and send enemies to the afterlife with one slash of his blade. In that setting, Princess Shuri appears like a bright star. Beautiful, intelligent, proud, and with standards for marriage even stricter than One Piece fans choosing their favorite arc. Countless princes and nobles line up to propose to her, but she rejects them all. Weak men, no, rude men, also no, men who cannot play music. Absolutely not. And when you hear those standards, you can immediately understand why Brook standing beside her feels so fitting. Brook at that time still carries the exact same personality we know. Funny, playful, and strangely charming despite being a little inappropriate. He teases Shuri, jokes around with her, and of course, drops his legendary question about the color of her panties. But behind that comedic surface, Oda starts planting some very cold hints. Brook talks about death, decay, and an empty stomach as the final end of all life. At first, it sounds like another bizarre joke from an unstable old uncle. But in truth, it feels like Oda is stabbing directly into Brook's future. The man who once talked about rotting flesh and the final remains of life would eventually lose not only his flesh, but even his stomach, becoming nothing but a dry skeleton holding a violin. But that moment is still not as painful as when Shuri asks Brook whether he truly feels grateful to the royal family of Asperia. That question opens the door to Brook's darkest past. When he was only an 11-year-old child starving at the bottom of society, the Asperia of the past was not always glamorous. Beneath the light of the palace were filthy slums, where Brook grew up more like a discarded creature than a human being. Thin, starving, dressed in rags, beaten and chased away by people around him. Young Brook barely had the right to exist properly. The only thing that still made him feel like a child was his love for music. He would stand outside windows, looking into rooms full of light, listening to instruments and songs, desperately wanting to step into a world he had no right to touch. And that is what makes Brook's story so painful. Oda is not simply telling us about poverty. He is telling us about the soul of an artist thrown into the lowest place in society. A child who loves beauty but has to fight for scraps of food. A boy who should have grown up with melodies but instead survives on frogs, insects, and silent days of misery. Honestly, after this, if anyone still sees Brook as nothing more than a comic relief skeleton, that is almost unfair to him. In the middle of that darkness, Brook's life gains one bright light. Reuven, a young man Brook calls his big brother. The two of them connect in a strange way, not through status, not through blood, but through understanding. Reuven brings Brook roasted grasshoppers and burned field frogs, which already sounds like survival cuisine. But the thing that shocks Brook is not the poor meal itself. It is the golden powder sprinkled on top of it, curry powder. At first it sounds cute, but this is Oda, so of course there is a knife hidden behind the meal. That holy curry powder later turns out to be an illegal addictive substance disguised as seasoning. In other words, the first time Brook tastes happiness through food. That happiness is connected directly to a filthy underground operation involving the Marines, the world government, and the dark system inside Asperia. Classic Oda, he lets a character have one delicious meal, then immediately prepares emotional damage. From here, the story shifts from a tragic childhood into organized crime. Brook is dragged into a major incident at the harbor, where the Marines and royal guards appear under the name of justice, but in reality, they are protecting illegal goods. Those huge wooden instrument boxes are not just instruments, they are covers for black market shipments. Brook, a wandering child who understands nothing, gets pulled into the middle of it, beaten, interrogated, and forced to answer questions simply because he was too close to an adult's secret. Then comes the biggest shock. The big brother Reuven whom Brook loves and respects is actually Prince Reuven, the heir to Asperia's throne. This is a heavy emotional punch, because it immediately changes the way we see everything. The person who gave Brook kindness turns out to be a prince. The person Brook thought was just another street-level friend is actually standing at the top of the kingdom's power structure. But the cruel irony is that this prince is also the only person who treats Brook like a normal human being. In the middle of this chaos, Candle appears. And she is terrifying in the best possible way. She is not only strong, she also sees through the entire situation almost instantly. The Marines are not there to enforce justice. They are there to protect a rotten system backed by the world government. Candle draws her sword, stands against them, and declares that she will protect the purity of Asperia until her final breath. This scene is extremely important because it shows that Asperia's tragedy was never random. This was not just a kingdom unlucky enough to fall into disaster. It was the result of a rotten system from the inside, where central power, illegal goods, nobility, military force, and the underworld were all twisted together like a nest of snakes. And a child like Brook was just a tiny piece being crushed inside that machine. After the harbor incident, Brook is pulled out of the mud by Candle. She protects him, gives him a place to stay, instruments, education, sword training, and above all, the chance to live as a real human being. From a child chased through the streets, Brook begins his path toward becoming one of Asperia's brightest stars. This part of the flashback is beautiful and painful at the same time. Because we all know Oda does not build a paradise like this unless he plans to tear it apart later. And yes, the later part of the story no longer stops at a poor child rises from hardship. It begins moving into something far more terrifying, the theft of identity. In the present timeline in Elbaf, Brook is facing Gunko, or more accurately, a Gunko who seems to have been taken over by Imu in some form. Brook begins to realize that this is not just simple mind control. The way Gunko transforms, the way her personality seems broken, the feeling that another voice is speaking through her body, all of it makes Brook see her as three layers of existence stacked on top of each other. Shuri, Gunko, and Gunkoimu. This detail is extremely important, because what once felt like a vague case of possession now starts to become something much more specific. The body as a vessel, the soul as something that can be overwritten, and the true self as something that can be pushed down but not necessarily erased. This is exactly why many people strongly connect this idea to Tot Musica from film Red. Not because Oda is directly copying the movie into the manga, but because he seems to be using a very similar symbolic language. Darkness, multiple layers of existence, black wings, hellish imagery, music, emotional resonance, and a host slowly losing control. If we follow this direction, film Red may even have quietly hinted at how Gunko can be saved. Tot Musica was not defeated by brute force alone. It required resonance from several sides, both emotional and physical, if Oda applies that logic to the current story. Then saving Gunko or pushing Imu out of her body cannot be solved simply by punching harder. It may require an external attack and an internal resistance at the same time. And that is where Brook, Chopper, and Luffy suddenly become important in completely different ways. Brook represents music, memory, and the emotional connection to the Shuri of the past. Chopper is the one who can interact with bodies and life in a very unusual way, treating what others call demonic transformation almost like a disease. And Luffy represents the will of liberation, the power to pull people out of distortion. These three storylines may seem unrelated, but they may actually be three pieces of the same key. And then Oda pushes the madness even further with Chapter 1186. The biggest shock here is that the tragedy of Asperia begins to gain another layer of truth. At first, Shuri killing King Reuven to end the war sounds extremely confusing, because if we only look at the result, the war did not really end in any meaningful way. The kingdom burned, the people lost everything, and the country collapsed. So the line, "The war is over, Brook, are you happy?" sounds more like a cover-up than an explanation. But when the chapter reveals that what the world government truly wanted was not 1,000 slaves, but Shuri herself, the entire story begins to change color. If that is true, then Reuven was not simply a helpless king. He may have been a man trying to protect Shuri at all costs, and if we look at it that way, his actions become both noble and selfish. Noble because he refused to treat Shuri like an object to be handed over to the world government. Selfish because as a king, he was not responsible for only one child, but for the entire nation and all the people who trusted his throne. This is where the story feels very real. A decision that is right from the perspective of a father can still be wrong from the perspective of a ruler. If Shuri realized that the war was continuing because of her, that more and more people were dying because of a lie created to protect her, then killing Reuven was not simply the act of killing a father. It was the painful decision of someone who had to cut down the very person who protected her in order to stop the tragedy from spreading further. But Oda still does not give us a complete answer, because all of this information comes through a Shuri whose state of mind is extremely suspicious. Is what she said the whole truth, or only a version of the truth that has been twisted? That uncertainty is what makes the flashback stronger. It does not hand us an answer, it simply changes the way we look at everything that happened. Then comes the next explosion. The goddess knight who appears in the past is actually Shuri's biological father. His name is Grollo, and with the detail of the unusual eyes, everything begins connecting to a special bloodline, to Gunko, and to a possible compatibility with powers directly related to Imu. From this point on, Shuri and Gunko are no longer just two names. They feel like two opposing selves inside the same body. One side is the child raised with love in Hesperia, while the other side is the weapon chained to the bloodline and contract of a goddess knight. The detail of Shuri stabbing Brook through the head using the very same technique he still uses later is even more painful, because that technique is no longer just a fighting move. It becomes a living memory of tragedy. Every time Brook uses that technique afterward, he is touching the day Hesperia collapsed, the day Reuven died. The day Shuri pierced his head. Oda is being very cruel here. He turns a skill into a psychological wound. But what is even more terrifying is that Brook survives. And that survival feels too precise. The sword goes through his head, but the major blood vessels and brainstem are not damaged. So did Shuri truly want to kill Brook? Or did some part of her hold back at the final moment? That uncertainty makes the scene even more painful. It is not innocent enough to forgive easily, but it is also not hopeless enough to abandon completely. And when we return to the present in Elbaf, this is exactly where Brook is pushed into the hardest question of his life. Can he trust Shuri one more time? Jimb asks him directly, is she an ally or an enemy? What should they do? Brook does not answer with certainty. Because the flashback does not give him an answer, it only forces him to face a wound he buried for far too long. If Shuri was truly being controlled back then, if what Brook saw was not her entire self, should he trust her one more time? But if she is still a goddess knight, still marked by the abyss, and still someone Imu can take over at any moment, then where should that trust be placed? This is why Shuri's story cannot end just by melting the ice or pushing Imu out of Gunko's body. As long as that mark still exists, Shuri is not truly free. At the same time, Oda suddenly shifts back to the present battlefield as if to remind us. Hey, do not forget, there is still a final boss tearing up Elbaf outside. Imu continues clashing with Loki. He starts talking again about what happened 800 years ago. About how the giants failed because they saved the children and how history will repeat itself. At this point, honestly, Imu feels like that old man who cannot sit down anywhere without telling a war story. The only difference is that when this old man finishes talking, he casually tries to destroy an island. But Imu's obsession with talking about the past is important, because every time he speaks, he is not just giving information. He is revealing how he sees history. In Imu's eyes, compassion is weakness. Saving people is a mistake, and that tells us exactly what kind of being he is. Someone who sees the lives of others as logical obstacles, not something worth protecting. And then, at the moment we need it most, Luffy returns. His punch straight into Imu's face at the end of the chapter is not only satisfying, it is also deeply symbolic. It feels like Luffy is saying what the entire world wants to say in one simple sentence: "Get out of here, you bastard." It is the kind of punch that feels like a debt from dozens of chapters ago finally being collected. Of course, Oda cannot let Luffy completely beat Imu right here. There is still Loki, there are still other battlefields. There is still Shuri, Chopper, Robin, Zoro, Sanji, Sommers, Killingham, and a whole mountain of unresolved problems. But that is exactly what makes everything so exciting. One Piece at this point is no longer about one main character carrying the entire world alone. It is about each character holding one piece of the solution. Luffy attacks directly, Loki holds the front line, Chopper cures the curse, Robin preserves knowledge. Brook carries memory, and Shuri Gunko stands on the border between identity and possession. If we had to summarize these two stories into one main idea, it would be this: Oda is quietly turning Brook's story into one of the most important emotional and mysterious axes of the final saga. From a skeleton uncle who was often used for comedy, Brook has now become a character connected to the deepest questions of the Elbaf arc. What is memory? What is identity? How much of a person remains when their body has been possessed? And can music, emotion, and memory pull someone back from the darkness, to put it in true Zozo anime style? We thought Oda brought Brook back into the spotlight just to tell some old tragic story and slow things down. But it turns out he is quietly turning this skeleton uncle into one of the heaviest lore pieces in the entire final saga. And that is what makes everything scary. Because when the war is no longer only about who is stronger, but about who can save whom, who can keep their soul, and who can pull someone else out of the abyss before they are completely swallowed. One Piece has clearly entered a completely different level, and that is the full combined analysis and breakdown from Zozo Anime about these two storylines. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to leave a like, share it, and most importantly, subscribe to Zozo Anime so you do not miss the next One Piece spoiler. Analysis and breakdown videos. What do you think about the connection between Brook, Shuri, Gunko, and Imu? Can Shuri truly regain her consciousness? And should Brook trust her one more time? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.